Black music and racial inequality have been inextricably linked since the 1920s, with Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, depicting the violence of Jim Crow in the South of the United States of America. The most prominent form of art that depicts and influences the civil rights movement in America was jazz music. Jazz music and the civil rights movement have a complex relationship, and often at times the two are inseparable. Within my analysis of the relationship, I'm going to move away from the big figures of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, they won't feature in my analysis. And by looking at this, I'm going to move away from the Montgomery to Memphis analysis and the great man theory. To show this, I'm going to use primary sources such as songs, books, and album cover work. But this has limitations. The limitations of this is that there is no way of proving definitively the relationship between black music and the civil rights movement. But I'm going to start with Mississippi Goddam by Nina Simone. Mississippi Goddam by Nina Simone was released on her debut album, performed at the Carnegie Hall in 1964, amidst the civil rights crisis in America. It demonstrates a paradigm shift in her music, her becoming deeply political. It is a direct response to the Medgar Evers murder in Mississippi and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Alabama, which resulted in the death of 4 young girls. It has deeply political lyrics. It features lines such as school children stuck in jail, hound dogs on my tail. These things are direct references to things that happened during the civil rights crisis. It's such a powerful song that in the 1986 Jet article, Nina Simone asserted that this song, whilst becoming one of her most popular and well-known ones, ruined her career. It ruined her chances with white producers, and as white people dominated the music scene in terms of the producers, she struggled to gain contracts and recording licenses from them after this song was released. This song is very much an emblem of freedom of speech in America. When Steve Allen, who presents the Steve Allen Show, wanted this song to be played on air, he was refused by the producers. He faced mass resistance, but he forced it through, and hence why this song is credited with dismantling censorship on TV in America. It became an anthem. Simone performed it in front of 40,000 people on the March to Selma with Martin Luther King. Ingrid Monson argues that in this sense, this image that Nina Simone presented demonstrates how jazz music was an arena of excellence for black people, where this idea of racial loyalty was forged, where black people would listen to African American people playing jazz music because they wanted to be loyal to their own race and the things that they were superior at. Monson argues that African American jazz musicians created the aesthetic standard for jazz music during the 1960s and 1950s. That she argues that within this, the aesthetic standard was set because the image that they presented was very much the image of jazz music itself, and therefore how important it was to the cultural and national development of this ethnic group in America. The Freedom Suite Now is an album by Max Roach featuring Abbey Lincoln. It is an album that encapsulates tensions between the black nationalists and the mainstream civil rights movement. It is perhaps best known for its jazz work with explicit political content from the civil rights years. It has a specific narrative pattern which follows the black population from slavery to emancipation to the modern civil rights movement at the time it was produced. On the inner lining of the record, it had an A. Philip Randolph quote, which stated, "A revolution is unfurling. America's unfinished revolution is unfurling on the lunch counters, libraries and schools." Its best known recording of the album was at a concert at the Village Gate for Core on January 15th, 1961. It had a variety of different actors and drum players, emphasizing the black nationalist agenda that's very deep behind Max Roach's ideology. It grew out of a work which was to celebrate the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863. There are kind of two contesting narratives for how this album came to be. Max Roach himself follows the idea that the NAACP invited him to create a piece for the aforementioned celebration, whereas Brown argues that Roach was asked to make a piece about the history of the African drum, from Africa to present day. In some way, this album characterises the conflicts, the yin and yang kind of dichotomy between the Oscar Brown and Max Roach producing this album, between the Malcolm X supporting black nationalist of Roach and the Martin Luther King peace, pacifist loving of Oscar Brown. This idea is kind of demonstrated in the first stanza of the last song, which has the ambiguous stanza, whisper, listen, whisper say we're free, rumours flying, must be lying, can it really be? The album was viewed as dangerous and it was banned in some states in America and also in South Africa due to a song called Tears for Johannesburg, which was about the Sharpeville massacre which took place, whereby innocent black protesters were fired upon by the South African military. The album occupied a sector of jazz that sat in a limbo between the mainstream jazz model and the new thing, this free jazz. It used blues formats and chorus structures. It had no piano in its ensemble, and it has moments of collective improvisation. There's also a moment in the song Prayer, Peace, a prayer, protest, peace, which demonstrates almost a step-by-step process of change. It has an aspect in it where screams are used as part of a special effect, which was not Abbey Lincoln's idea and it was not favoured by Oscar Brown. However, Max Roach said that this screaming is almost like he thought it as symbolic of a catharsis of the black community breaking out and breaking away from the chains that hold them down. And this definitely shows the influence of civil rights upon jazz music, and vice versa, as this idea is reciprocated and pushed back onto the listener himself. Alabama is a 1963 song that appeared on John Coltrane's album Live at Birdland. It features saxophonist John Coltrane playing a song that is a direct response to, again, like Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Alabama. It is a sad song and reflects his feelings and how he has been affected by such a horrible moment in human history. This song, like many other songs, were played at benefit concert gigs that were aimed at supporting black causes financially, including the civil rights but not limited to it, and had musicians performing alongside country and folk singers such as Bob Dylan and alongside movie stars such as Marlon Brando. Regular members of this community who attended these events to raise money included Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, Max Roach, and Abbey Lincoln. This list is not exhaustive either, and it demonstrates the real and tangible support for civil rights amongst the black African American jazz playing community. And from the arrival of the seminal piece Blues People by Amiri Baraka and Frank Kofsky's Black Nationalism and Revolution in Music, free jazz has been associated with the raging politics of the period, with characters such as Charles Mingus taking a forefront and standing in this activism, this musical activism against the repression. Although these concerts have a long history since the 1930s, the moment when the Greensboro sit-ins began, it demonstrated a paradigm shift in the civil rights movement A new era of mass mobilization had begun, and crucially and symbolically, this affected jazz and the whole African American community. It signalled a change in jazz music. Free jazz became to the forefront. It became the new thing. This type of jazz that doesn't hold to the old-fashioned tenors and choruses and melodies that jazz music did before. These concerts were for a variety of causes and responded to events such as the Birmingham movement and the March on Washington, and they raised considerable amounts of money. These events acted also in a more complex way, and it's far too simple to understand them as simply financial lines. These events acted as a direct line of communication between northern audiences and southern activists, the latter who were telling their story from the front line. They created social spaces that northern performers felt like they were aiding the south, an area like described before where African American people set the aesthetic standard and aided these organisations that were fighting for black equality. Although these performers often had political inclinations to one side or the other, they were often not discriminate. Some performers might perform for the Nation of Islam concerts, and some might perform, and the very same people might perform for CORE or for Martin Luther King's group. So Monson reminds us that when researching this history, it is often important to ensure that we do not make generalizations about the political stature and orientation of jazz players. Those who preferred the old style of jazz were not necessarily conservative, and those who played free jazz did not necessarily favour activism. In this way, it is important to almost see jazz music and civil rights as jazz music supporting civil rights in its entirety, not a single stratum of it. It supported the very notion of equality in America. Desmond King argues that the relationship between jazz and African Americans is a complex one, but traditionally the two have been closely associated. He suggests that Charles Mingus, one of the most prominent and most political jazz musicians of the time, was the black music experience in the USA, but not in the sense that it was a pure experience. He suggests that many historians play down the cultural hybridity of jazz music and the civil rights music to look for a pure black persona untouched by the white community. Mingus was very much part of the post-war era, which saw a transitioning of black musicians from being performers to being serious artists. Sociologists often look for the deviancy of jazz music and identify jazz artists, including Mingus, as people who contributed to activism in the period. Mingus provided the beginning for what could be seen as the rise of the black art form, which was predicted by African American poet Langston Hughes in the 1920s, which formed a melting pot for black individuality. Mingus rejected the minstrel style of black music, this deferential position that some musicians such as Nat King Cole and Louis Armstrong held up in jazz music. Nat King Cole got beaten up after playing at a segregated bar when the civil rights movement hit full swing. For one example of Charles Mingus's music which does this is his satirical piece about the Arkansas governor Orville Forbes in the song Fables of Falbus, in which didn't have lyrics the first time he recorded it, but because his record label saw it as far too controversial. But Mingus later recorded it with lyrics that stated 2, 4, 6, 8, they brainwash you and teach you hate, a pun on the lyrics of a famous motif of the anti-integrationist movement, which was 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. He was mocking the kind of institutional racism and institutional inequality that was so deeply ingrained into American society. His involvement in the civil rights movement prompted other songs such as the Haitian Fight Song, which is playing at the moment, The song is a reference to the Haitian Revolution, the only ever successful slave rebellion which overthrew the French colonial government. It's almost like it's a celebration of African American modernism and questions the myth of progress from the viewpoint of a slave. He established an anti-Newport Jazz Festival in 1960 because he thought black artists were being underpaid, and he promoted black art in black communities, though not as an affiliate as for the black nationalist movement. He saw black musicians as slaves of white jazz clubs, leading to the release of what can be considered his greatest album ever, The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady in 1963. That album has been often thought as a struggle for equality, but also a struggle for racial consciousness. A racial consciousness which I believe to be explored in Sonny's Blues, a book which I'm going to examine next. Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin is a 1957 book by an author who resided in part of the Harlem Renaissance and the post-Renaissance that happened in Harlem literature and racial consciousness in the 20th century. It's a book about a troubled jazz player, a heroin addict, from the perspective of his brother, who doesn't really understand what his troubles are, and he invites his brother to live with him after he gets out of prison. But he doesn't understand why and how jazz music is so important to him. But when he goes to listen to him play, it's almost like a biblical catharsis. He finally understands exactly what jazz does, and it's likened to heroin running through his brother's veins. It liberates his brother, makes him it makes him whole, and that's almost what I feel is a perfect metaphor for jazz music in the civil rights movement. Jazz music in the civil rights movement almost can be seen as a way in which it's almost a way in which the people of the time used it to express their feelings, a desire for equality, a desire for freedom that wasn't expressed by any other type of music. And that is almost why Sonny's Blues can be seen as like the epitome of the relationship between civil rights and the jazz music. As a continuation to the bit about Sonny's Blues, I need to mention first the fact that much of the support for the racial consciousness of the African American population was founded politically in both the Harlem Literati, as argued by Robin D.G. Kelly, and the Communist Party of America. Leftist critics both now and then promote this idea that jazz was the most democratizing culture that the nation possessed, and it, as a genre, permeated the Communist Party of the 1930s, with most of the early criticism being published by its political press. Artists worked for the Works Progress administration with people such as Baldwin and Hughes, headed by Louise Thompson and the Communist Party. The party's high anti-profile, anti-racist causes attracted the jazz community to it. And amongst these people were people like Art Blakey with his album The Freedom Rider, which you can hear on in the background now. It was for the drum solos. There is a 6-minute drum solo which is one track of the album. It's like a brand of hard bop, and it's named after the Freedom Riders. It has an angry sound, it's rough and violent, much like the Riders themselves. And during the spring of 1961, student activists from CORE launched the Freedom Riders to challenge segregation on interstate buses and terminals. These protesters travelled from Washington DC to Jackson in Mississippi and met resistance in the South. Their campaign was media successful and forced JFK to secure the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) ban on segregation. The ride was planned to test the ruling of Morgan versus Virginia in 1946, which made interstate transportation segregation illegal, and the later ruling in 1960, which declared it unconstitutional. Martin Luther King said that they wouldn't make it through Alabama, which in truth they probably didn't, because the KKK had been given the green light to attack them buses were firebombed, and I feel like this is really reflected in the music itself. The drum solos of the Freedom Rider, performed by Blakey, are loud and violent, as I said before, and represent a violent defiance of white oppression. According to Lawson in his article, it represented the momentum that the nationalistic forces had gained. This kind of sound is not unique in terms of the jazz music genre and canon itself. It almost demonstrates how civil rights had permeated jazz music, and this is their response, like pushing back against the trials and tribulations that black people were facing at the time in America and elsewhere in the world. It's almost a move towards this racial consciousness, combined with the Sonny's blues and all the other musical aspects of jazz music. This really demonstrates how jazz music and civil rights can be fused together, and it's almost one kind of entity that existed as a racial form of music in the 1950s and 1960s in America. The relationship between jazz music and the civil rights movement can be asserted to be this also almost symbiotic relationship, where this symbiosis in which the civil rights movement and jazz music coexist as social forces in the mid to late 20th century. They coexist in a position where they influence each other, but are not the direct control over how one or the other develops. There was jazz music outside of the civil rights movement, and there was civil rights outside of the jazz music movement. However, it is important to see how songs such as Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam were created in response to events of the civil rights movement, and were created and then therefore became part of the movement. And this relationship, this continuum of music to movement and music to movement, that really defines how this relationship stands. Throughout this whole project, I've tried to look at music as a music fan. I have no experience of the tenors and notes. I can't read music and I cannot play music. And I've tried to move away from this musicologist historiography of Ham and Frith, who look at the notes and the tenors and how things change in the physical way. However, I've tried to look at the social implications that the music has. And perhaps it has led me to think that maybe jazz music and civil rights follows this sociological pattern developed by Talcott, which is a process of acceptance for minorities in society, which is forging a relationship through jazz, whereby they go from being ignored, excluded, to being assimilated, where some musicians take on characteristics of the dominant party, so to assimilate into their society, to full-on inclusion. But there is no way that the use of the primary sources in this question can be conclusive. The primary sources are essential to the forging of this idea that the two were symbiotic, and with the use of the primary sources has illuminated the ways in which jazz music and civil rights were essential parts of the 20th century. And perhaps the irony of the song playing in the background whilst you listen to this is that, can we really say that 20th century America was really a wonderful one?